Good morning. So first, I would like to thank Anita and Alex for inviting me here today. When they first asked me to speak, I was delighted. I'm a professor, so I teach several classes several times a week, and so speaking in front of a crowd of people is an occupational hazard, and I love it. The other thing that I pondered, and it very humbled me, was to think, why me? Right? I was like, why me? I don't do this. And I'm learning many of your names and getting to meet you for the first time. And so hopefully by the end of this talk, I will have answered, why me? So today I'm going to take you on my journey. And my journey is from medicine to meat. And throughout this whole process, I have come to find my purpose. I come from the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Biomedical Engineering. I'm part of the Materials Science graduate program, and very recently part of the Food Systems graduate program. So let's start this journey from the very beginning. When I was younger, at about the age of 3, I was put into ballet class, and I studied the French style of classical ballet for 15 years. And in the process of all of that training and all of that performing, I learned the importance of having exact movement. I had the training to take something that was very, very difficult to do and make it look easy. And I also had that training to make something elegant, a piece of art. And so that is one seed that was planted inside of me from a very, very young age. As I entered school and I went through elementary and middle school, I discovered science, right? And one of the experiments, and I remember this in 3rd grade, I came from a small town with a lot of farming. And someone brought in some lamb lungs, some sheep lungs. And through that process, we learned what an organ is and how an organ functions. And they gave us straws to blow into the lungs, and now when I think about it, it's terrifying. But it captured my attention right away. And I loved math. So I liked being able to tell someone they were right or wrong. And I liked being right. Okay. So there was another seed that was planted in me. I loved science, and I loved that curiosity. And then last but not least, my parents. They were there. My mom, when I was growing up, with a nurse's aide, and she worked at the local hospital. And when I was younger, I would go to visit her, and it was very touching how people who were vulnerable, in pain, didn't know where they were, trusted my mother to help them feel better. And I was inspired by that, okay? My father was the postal manager at the local post office. And of course, getting your mail, all of you expect that, right? We are entitled in this country to get our mail. And so his job absolutely was important. And his sense of humor became very well known throughout our town. And so both of my parents had jobs with purpose. And that was another seed that was planted in me at a very, very young age. So now let's move on to my motivation. So loving science, seeing designing something and building something as a piece of art, and also knowing that my parents were there helping people, I decided to go into biomedical engineering. And throughout my graduate career and my postdoctoral training, all of the people I'm going to mention today motivated me to get to where I am. So first, I mentioned that I went into biomedical engineering. It seemed like the best of both worlds. Did I know what biomedical engineering was? Absolutely not. So as a background and to feel a little bit more comfortable, I also minored in fine arts. There was a very important person, Professor Deborah Charlesworth, and she taught biomaterials as an undergrad. And we used Dr. Alan Hoffman's and Dr. Buddy Ratner's textbook, and I fell in love immediately. And I went to her after a class one day, and I said, I want to do what you do. What do I have to do what you do? And she said, get a PhD. And I said, well, crap, okay. So we're going to go get a PhD. And so I did, but I went and got a master's and a PhD in mechanical engineering because through my undergrad, I realized that biomedical was so, so broad, and I was really into how to make things, how to break things, how to design stuff that moved, how to design a piece of art. So I went to Colorado State and I worked with Professor Susan James, who essentially built in me this desire and this love of teaching and communicating science. So after I graduated with my PhD, I was definitely set to become a professor, to go somewhere, but I wasn't done building my resume. I wanted to learn other aspects of engineering so that I could do almost anything, right? We all want to be able to do anything. So I went to the University of Washington. I worked 2 professors that were in the bioengineering department, and they were also trained as chemical engineers. And so here I took my love for biomaterials, looking at the mechanics of biomaterials, and now I started to get an appreciation for the chemistry behind these biomaterials. I worked with 2 professors, 2 people that have become very important mentors to me even to this day. And Professor James Bryars, he worked in immunology. He worked in looking at the immune system and how the immune system responds to foreign objects, i.e. implants and biomaterials. Professor Buddy Ratner, whose book I used as an undergrad, it was awe-inspiring to finally be able to sit down with him over a cup of coffee, one-on-one, and talk about chemistry of materials. And so because of these 3 people, I finally made it. I felt like I was ready to apply to have my own lab and to be a professor, the furthest anyone in my family has ever gotten. And so I did. I succeeded in my first major goal, and I became a professor. I quickly established my lab, and I didn't want to use my last name because this isn't about me, it's about creating a community. So the community that I developed was the Engineered Biomaterials Research Laboratory. And even though our crest has 2 femurs on there, right, it was going beyond medicine. This was engineered biomaterials for various applications. A tagline that we ended up taking on was advanced healing through engineering. And throughout the years, that healing has grown to mean much more than healing the human body. It's about healing our world, healing the environment. Everything is in pain, and everything is suffering. So where I started in my work, looking at both healing the planet and healing the human bodies, I started to develop biomaterials, i.e. polymers and plastics that were made out of natural materials. And much like many of you in this space, I work with alginate, and I started working with alginate back in 2010. So with all of the training in solid mechanics and polymer chemistry, I started looking at taking natural materials such as alginate and designing these designer hydrogels. These hydrogels where we could define the structure, control the properties, and make this material a beautiful work of art that could go into the human body and produce a specific function. So creating these designer hydrogels, again, it's not just dependent on one degree or one person. You need to build a team. And the team that I was able to build in my laboratory is comprised of biologists, material scientists, mechanical engineering, and biomedical engineering. Biomedical engineering being very, very broad. So as I mentioned before, we started off with alginate, and here is the chemical structure of alginate, and it's a sugar. It's pretty simple. So what I did is I thought about some of that synthetic work that I did throughout my graduate career, and I started applying those chemistries to these natural materials. And so very quickly, we created a toolbox of all these modifications of the alginate backbone. So we're able to create chemistries that will allow the material to be cross-linked by light. Inherently, this material can be cross-linked by salt, and that's why many of us enjoy that process. It's relatively inexpensive. We can also pegylate our material, as many of us like to do as well, especially in the medical field and in drug delivery. And that imparts a very specific functionality that we have a choice of. I can actually go to the internet and look up a catalog. And then following some of the other work that people have done in this space, looking at biomaterials and tissue engineering, we can also change the properties of this material to make it cell adhesive or tissue adhesive. Now, this all happened on alginate, and I'm showing you the detailed structures here, but we didn't stop there. Based on the work that I've done before and the current research that's taking place, we've expanded beyond alginate. We've looked at other naturally sourced materials. And I realize that some of the structures are blurry, and that's fine, because most of you don't care, right, about the chemical structures. But indeed, the ones that we have been looking at, starting in the right-hand corner at 1 o'clock, that would be lignin. Lignin is an elastic polymer, and it's derived from plants. We look at this material as sort of bio-waste remediation, and we actually get it from the pits of mangoes and avocados and stuff like that. So we're looking at that material as part of a hydrophobic system. The other one in the bottom right corner is casein, so that comes from milk or from dairy. We've looked at that. And we've also looked at hyaluronic acid, which is on the bottom right. Traditionally, that would come from rooster comb or some other animal source, but now we don't need the animal source in order to get that material. On the bottom left, we have collagen, as many of us use in this space. We've also looked at that. And we have also looked at heparin. So this is something more recently where we're starting to figure out, is there a way to create a biologically responsive material without using expensive growth factors or other protein modifications? So in this space, we've gone from just hydrogels, and now, we're going to start talking about the scaffolds, which is also something that I've been doing for a very long time. And I looked at both the synthetic space and the natural material space. Regardless of what we start with, the goal in tissue engineering and in designing these scaffolds is to have something that's sustainable. That was my goal. I did not want to depend on these synthetic materials that are derived from fossil fuels. That's not the way to heal our earth. So I started looking at sustainable materials. When looking at tissue engineering, I don't have bone up here, right? Actually, I don't even say tissue. But different tissues, right, especially muscle, fish muscle, beef muscle, they'll have very specific properties, right? We're all used to handling them in a certain way. So if I design a scaffold, I want it to have tunable properties. I want to have complete and absolute control, and that is the engineer inside of me, right? And then I want it to be functional tissue. So at the end of the day, whether I end up putting it in the human body or I end up looking at this material in the laboratory, I want to know that it's functioning in the way that I had designed it to be. So taking all of these into consideration, I can make smart materials, which really are just stimuli-responsive materials. So whether I start with sustainable materials, and now I want to tune the properties, maybe I want to tune those properties at a very specific time. So I can hit that material with light, and boom, 48 hours, it has changed its stiffness. Now, a lot of this control is very important because, as we know, growing tissue is a time-dependent process. And so if we can somehow match the properties of that tissue as those cells are creating their home and setting down a foundation for that tissue, that would be remarkable. And the idea is to be able to use mechanics and chemistry to control those properties and to control our functional tissue. And this is, again, trying to move away from animal source proteins and growth factors and looking at mechanics to design this material. So the base is not only in the mechanics, it's the mechanics of the material. So I'm going to show you, and let's just put up all the images, right? I'm going to show you all of these different ways that I have created these materials, whether it's out of chitosan on the top, alginate in the bottom, and in the middle. So in the top, you can see we have these electrosprayed fibers, right, or these electrospun fibers. And these fibers are analogous and perfect for certain tissue types. What's nice is depending on the chemistry and the actual design of that device and of that process, we can control the density of the fibers, i.e. controlling our porosity, which controls fluid flow and shear stresses. We can also control the thickness of those fibers. So if we want to tell the cells to do something very specific for a very specific tissue in a very specific part of the body, we can do that. In the middle, you can see these are porous materials where we haven't laid down any fibers, but we've taken a whole hydrogel. We've taken our whole designer hydrogel, and we can create these porous materials, whether they look like these beautiful sponges on the left and in the middle of that middle row, or they look like more organized, more macro porous materials. And these, of course, lend not only to differences in mechanical properties, but lend to different biological reactions from the cells that are cultured onto these materials. On the bottom left, we have microspheres. These are about 400 microns in diameter, and we can go all the way down to 400 nanometers. Many of you will take these particles and you will grow cells on the outside in order to culture cells or to grow up your tissue. And that's something that we've looked at as well. Another nice thing is depending on the size of our materials, we are able to change the properties so cells can go inside and they can get outside, right? Or we can change the structure of these materials in real time to get cells to come off, maybe, and lay down a different matrix. And then the images on the bottom where I have this purple-pink hydrogel, this is just to show that we can make these things as thin strips. We can take these strips, hydrate them, like in that bottom right picture. We can make them sticky, not sticky. We can make them hard and fibrous, right? That which will match muscle tissue, and we can make them soft, squishy, compliant for fat tissue. And all of this can be based on the mechanics and the structure of the material, which has been shown repeatedly in the biomaterials traditional tissue engineering world. And so now let me take you through a review of all of the research and try to answer that question of why am I here? Okay. So when I started out in graduate school, I started out with synthetic plastics, and I actually made a product. This we dubbed biopoly, which is that white plastic on top, and it has been molded into a titanium porous implant. And this implant is an osteochondral plug, as you can see in that x-ray. I went through the regulatory process of this material. We licensed that technology from Colorado State and sold it off to Schwartz Biomedical, which eventually became Biopoly. And it is now about to be implanted into people as a consumer product in the United States. That was very exciting, but I got to see that regulatory process, and let me tell you, we just got the patent 17 years later? So next, what I did is I moved from that synthetic material, and I thought that is really silly to replace bone and cartilage with metal and plastic. It's not the same, just to let you know, right? And so I wanted to engineer cartilage, and so I started off with rat cells, eventually moving on to human cells. So now here we have a lot more information. It's much more analogous to look at a larger animal, like a human, and try and design this tissue that has the same structure, the same properties, so it can perform the same function. Then, as I went on throughout my research, as I mentioned before, we use natural materials. That was something that was important to me. I wanted to start to use something that was sustainable, to create this cyclical process that could be sustainable while maintaining the health of our world, or what's left, and then the health of people, right? But up to this point, I have looked at trying to get people back on the tennis courts. I was getting people back to skiing downhill with all of these orthopedic implants. And I felt like there was something missing. Doing the natural material work, looking at bio-waste remediation was important, but it still wasn't enough. I eventually got to that point where I didn't feel like what I was doing was making a difference. And then 2 years ago, I had a very, very talented graduate student applicant who came to me and said, "Can I do everything that you're doing but grow meat?" And I said, "Yeah, what kind of meat?" "Cow meat." Okay. It was the first time I went online and was exposed to those terrifying, saddening facts that all of you know and all of you are familiar with. And so what I realized is everything that I had been trained to do would allow me to do that. It was the first time where I felt like the stuff that I knew how to do, I finally had a reason for doing it. I could finally make a big difference. So going from something that had a medical impact, which of course is important, but generally I feel like those who receive these medical products are those that are privileged or live in a country where health insurance is available and where you have surgeons that can do these types of surgeries. And yes, when I started looking at the bio-waste remediation, it did have an environmental impact, but still, that was small. That wasn't all-encompassing. And now when I consider the work that all of you do, it is a societal impact. That is much more important to me. That is much more touching to my heartstrings. And so eventually, we got to cultivated meat. And here I will say that being a part of this diagram, which is the scaffold on the bottom right, is meaningful to me. I can become part of this process. I have the scientific curiosity to try and solve this problem. But also when I look at this and I look at the work that all of you are doing, it's a work of art. It's beautiful. It's elegant. It's simple. It's made of many components. And you make it all look very, very easy, okay? But it's because of all of you that I now also have a job with purpose. Thank you.
If you have any questions, please line up here.
See, I'm not at the front of my classroom, so I can't pick on you, although I do have one student here who's probably ducking his head. He's fantastic. Irfanta here is his name. If you want to go say hello, please do. Just don't take him from me. He doesn't graduate for 2 years. Yeah.
Hi, this is Shrutika from Vitro Labs. Thank you so much for your talk. I felt like it was very inspiring, your journey to cultured meat. But I would love to ask you a question about more scientific aspect of your scaffolds. It seems like you have made it look very easy for the muscles and the tissue and the scaffolds to make the cells do whatever they want. I just wanted to ask you how scalable you think all those scaffolds are that are tunable.
How available they are? Sorry.
Scalable. Scalable. To the
Scalable. Oh, yes, very good question. So as a mechanical engineer, I like to have things that I can break, okay? Killing cells is exciting and growing cells is exciting, but scalability is a big deal to us. And in teaching mechanical engineering, we also teach our engineering students that you want to make it as cheap as possible, as quick as possible, and as meaningful as possible, okay? And it's also like a piece of art, right? So if we are able at the micro scale to keep something simple, my art teacher would always say, kiss it, keep it simple, sweetheart, right? If we're able to do that, then yes, we're able to scale up. So many of our things, whether it's an additive manufacturing or we 3D print molds, much like they do for bone tissue engineering, in order to then injection mold some of our plastic materials, we are able to go very large. And a lot of that has to do with these stimuli responsive materials, is understanding the temperature gradient through our material, the diffusion kinetics of our material. A lot of it is in the structural mechanics and the thermodynamics of our material. If you understand that and you can get together with someone who does manufacturing, such as electrospinning, electrospraying, injection molding, I do believe it is very, very scalable. And even if you didn't need it to be scalable, right, to the point where you're not trying to make these monstrous T-bone steaks, right, maybe like a 4-ounce filet mignon or something, then it would be the quickness and the ease with which you could produce these. And so if I can create materials that don't have those biological components, which oftentimes can be very, very fragile, and I can create a material and through that processing get the exact properties that I want, then yes, I truly believe it's scalable.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I asked is because we are in the leather business, so you might have heard about Vitro Labs, and what we are trying to do is actually make those big pieces of tissue rather than steaks. So
yes.
That's hence the question of scalability, because
yes.
we are definitely going after the big size.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I know a little bit about that industry only because I also had an undergraduate work at a startup in Boston this summer. And they were essentially using the sludge from kombucha to try and create leather. And some of the products, it was fantastic. It was amazing looking at these. But in order to get the large size leathers, let's say you wanted to do a couch, right? Then essentially it would be this roller technology where you would just roll out these sheets. And if they were able to create a culture that was large enough, if they were able to create every aspect of that pressure, the temperature, the time that the material is moving through it, yeah, they were able to create very, very nice sheets in a relatively short amount of time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. No more questions? Really? Oh, okay. Yes?
What types or classes of materials are you guys actually working on, and what is your favorite application or type of structure or particular type of meat that you guys are working on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in all the manufacturing type stuff that we do, I think stereolithography is amazing. And if we can create one slab of material that based on shining a light on it or designing the material to have different stiffnesses starting off, if I could create a very unique pattern, right, like a beautiful marbled piece of beef, then that would be fantastic. And again, I'm trying to control the scaffold itself so that we can take stem cells, which are much more amenable to turning into different cell types, and possibly get that fat and that meat to grow alongside each other, just like nature developed it. I'm not trying to redo nature, but that's the best part of my job, is I don't think we're gonna get there. Mimicking biomaterials is insane, right? And mimicking doesn't mean, hey, look at what we got. It's the whole process of tissue development. And I think that far-reaching goal is super exciting for me. And that's what I've always loved to do. And so cartilage is one of my favorites, because that is a real, that is a troubled child, you know, to try and tackle that. So I like a challenge, not gonna lie. Yeah.